Boxing Day, December 26, 1946. Hatfield Heath, Essex. The winter afternoon was cold and damp, the kind of English weather that seeps through clothing and settles in bones. Approximately 1,000 spectators, an extraordinary crowd for a village football match, lined the pitch at Howard Piles Field, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. On one side of the pitch stood British villagers bundled in overcoats and scarves, stamping their feet against the cold. On the opposite side stood a column of German and Austrian prisoners of war in dark uniforms, marched under armed guard from their camp less than a mile away. They had been given strict orders. Stand at attention, clap politely when your team scores. No cheering, no celebrations that might disturb the fragile peace of this strange spectacle. Between these two crowds, 22 men prepared to play football, 11 from Hatfield Heath FC, 11 from the prisoner of war camp. What happened over the next 90 minutes would become village legend, though not for the reasons the home side had hoped. The match was a massacre. The final score read 11-0 in favor of the prisoners, a humiliation so complete that it would be commemorated 75 years later not as a shameful defeat but as the most famous match in club history. The German prisoners moved across the muddy pitch with technical precision that spoke of years of training and natural talent that village footballers could not match. They passed with accuracy, moved without the ball with tactical sophistication, and finished chances with clinical efficiency. The Hatfield Heath players, hard-working men who labored on farms and in shops during the week, could only watch as the prisoners demonstrated football at a level the village had never witnessed. After the final whistle, the Heath side accepted an invitation that would have seemed impossible just 18 months earlier when the war still raged. They walked back to the prisoner camp for refreshments. Village folklore maintains that supplies were smuggled out of local pubs, so the teams could enjoy festive drinks together, former enemies sharing beer and conversation, while armed guards looked on with bemusement at this strange peace. This match was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern that repeated across Britain in hundreds of camps, holding 400,000 German prisoners during and after the Second World War. Football became the unexpected common ground where captors and captives competed under rules both sides understood, where military hierarchies temporarily dissolved into sporting rivalries, where men who had recently tried to kill each other now argued about offside decisions and celebrated goals together. For the German prisoners arriving in Britain throughout the war, nothing in their training or indoctrination had prepared them for this reality. They had been told to expect torture, starvation, brutal guards eager to exact revenge for German bombing of British cities. Instead, they found football pitches, orchestras, theaters, and libraries. The cognitive dissonance was profound and, for many prisoners, more effective at undermining Nazi ideology than any interrogation or propaganda campaign could achieve. To understand the shock German prisoners experienced, we must first understand what they expected. The Nazi propaganda apparatus had spent years constructing elaborate narratives about British barbarism that served multiple strategic purposes. Wehrmacht soldiers and Luftwaffe aircrews received explicit briefings before combat operations warning them that capture by British forces meant torture and likely death. Intelligence officers reading from prepared scripts described interrogation techniques that would be employed against captured Germans. Beatings with rubber truncheons that left no visible marks, sleep deprivation cells where prisoners were kept under bright lights for days until their minds broke, starvation rations designed to weaken resistance, mock executions to break the will. The specific methods varied in the telling, but the consistent message was clear. Capture meant suffering worse than death in combat. This propaganda served calculated objectives beyond simple fear-mongering. First, it encouraged German soldiers to fight with desperate intensity rather than surrender when tactical situations became hopeless. Every German soldier who died fighting rather than surrendering was one more obstacle Allied forces had to overcome with blood and ammunition. Second, it provided moral justification for Germany's own violations of the Geneva Convention in treating Allied prisoners. If the British tortured German captives, then German mistreatment of British prisoners was merely reciprocal justice, not criminal behavior. Third, it prepared German prisoners psychologically to resist interrogation by framing any decent treatment as manipulation, a temporary softening designed to extract information before the real torture began. Even genuinely humane treatment could thus be dismissed as elaborate deception, making prisoners suspicious of every kindness and courtesy they received. The propaganda infrastructure that delivered these messages was sophisticated and pervasive. Films produced by the Reich Ministry of Propaganda depicted British brutality with carefully staged scenes designed to appear documentary in nature. Movies like Ohm Kruger portrayed British concentration camps during the Boer War with graphic depictions of civilian suffering, implicitly arguing that British barbarism was historical policy spanning decades, not merely wartime necessity. Radio broadcasts reinforced these messages daily. Newspapers printed stories about alleged British atrocities. Even children's books and school textbooks presented the British Empire as a plutocratic, militaristic power that had always shown contempt for German culture and would show no mercy to captured German soldiers. The cumulative effect was total psychological preparation to expect torture upon capture. September 14, 1939, marked the capture of Britain's first German prisoners of the Second World War. Captain Gerhard Glatz and the 43 crew members of submarine U-39, sunk by destroyers HMS Faulkner and HMS Foxhound in the western approaches just days after war was declared. These men became the first test case for British prisoner of war policy, and the treatment they received established patterns that would define British captivity for the entire conflict. Glatz would serve 7.5 years in British custody, longer than the war itself lasted, finally released in April 1947. During those years, he was never beaten despite having attempted to sink British shipping with torpedoes. He was never tortured for information about German submarine tactics that would have been invaluable intelligence for the Royal Navy fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. Instead, he and his crew were processed according to military regulations, provided with adequate quarters, treated as captured military personnel entitled to protections under the 1929 Geneva Convention. Initially, only 2 prisoner of war camps were established in Britain, reflecting the small numbers captured during the phony war period when large-scale ground combat had not yet commenced. Camp No. 1 at Grisdale Hall in Lancashire was a 40-room Georgian mansion set in extensive grounds near Lake Windermere, requisitioned from its private owners for the duration of the war. The location was remote, surrounded by the rugged terrain of the Lake District, which British authorities calculated would make escape attempts difficult and recapture likely. The facility was reserved exclusively for captured officers, reflecting the Geneva Convention's requirement that officers be housed separately from enlisted men and accorded privileges appropriate to their rank. It became known among German prisoners as the U-boat hotel because so many of its early inhabitants were submarine officers captured when their vessels were sunk in the North Sea and Atlantic. The facility had space for 200 prisoners, but in November 1939 it housed only 21 men. Camp No. 2 at Glen Mill in Oldham, Lancashire, was a former cotton mill converted to house 2,000 other ranks, enlisted personnel and non-commissioned officers not entitled to the privileges accorded to commissioned officers. The facility was more austere than Grisdale Hall, with dormitory-style sleeping arrangements in the former factory floors, but it met basic Geneva Convention standards for shelter, sanitation, and security. During the early war phase, Britain sent most prisoners to Canada as soon as transport could be arranged, keeping the total number held within the United Kingdom below 2,000 men, while approximately 9,000 German prisoners accumulated in Canadian camps by late 1942. The fall of France in June 1940 and the subsequent Battle of Britain changed everything. Luftwaffe aircraft now operated from French airfields within easy range of southern England, and RAF fighters shot down increasing numbers of German planes. Captured aircrews accumulated faster than they could be shipped to Canada, particularly as the Battle of the Atlantic made convoy operations increasingly dangerous. The policy shifted. Prisoners would be held in Britain for extended periods, necessitating rapid expansion of camp facilities. By war's end, approximately 500 camps operated throughout England, Scotland, and Wales, ranging from large central facilities holding thousands to small working camps attached to individual farms. The camps themselves were revelations to men expecting torture chambers and starvation cages. Prisoners arriving at facilities found organized communities with accommodations that, while certainly not luxurious, met Geneva Convention requirements and often exceeded them. Wooden barracks constructed according to military specifications provided weatherproof shelter with heating stoves for winter months. Each prisoner received a bed with mattress, blanket, and pillow. Washing facilities included shower blocks with hot water scheduled regularly. Toilets were adequate and maintained to prevent disease. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire fencing and guard towers, certainly, but within the perimeter prisoners found living conditions that were humane by any reasonable standard and dramatically better than the starvation pens Nazi propaganda had described. Daily life followed predictable routines that became themselves a form of psychological warfare against Nazi expectations. Nazi propaganda had portrayed British captivity as chaotic brutality. Random beatings, arbitrary punishment, unpredictable violence. Instead, prisoners experienced order and consistency that was almost boring in its predictability. Morning roll call occurred at the same time each day. Meals were served at fixed times with remarkable consistency. Work details departed at regular hours. Evening recreation periods were allocated from 1900 to 2100 hours. Lights out at 2200 hours was enforced strictly. For men who had been told to expect constant violence, the discovery that their daily lives followed mundane, predictable patterns was profoundly disorienting to their ideological certainty. But it was the recreation facilities that challenged expectations most dramatically and became the centerpiece of British psychological operations, whether British authorities fully realized it or not. Football emerged as the dominant recreational activity in prisoner-of-war camps across Britain, and the stories of these matches represent some of history's most remarkable examples of normalization between enemies during wartime. Prisoners could play matches using equipment provided by British authorities or the International Committee of the Red Cross, which supplied footballs, corner flags, goal nets when available, and even proper boots for those whose military boots were unsuitable for sport. The provision of this equipment was not mere humanitarian gesture but calculated policy. Occupied prisoners with structured activities caused fewer security problems and maintained better mental health than bored men with nothing to do but nurse grievances. Prisoner football teams formed along natural lines within camps, by barracks, by former military units, by regional origins in Germany. The Bavarians formed teams distinct from Prussians. Former paratroopers played against former infantry. Luftwaffe crews challenged Wehrmacht soldiers. These internal divisions created the foundation for organized competitions with regular schedules posted on camp notice boards. Teams developed identities, adopted names, created insignia from scrap materials. Supporters groups formed among non-playing prisoners who attended matches and cheered their chosen teams with partisan enthusiasm that would not have been out of place at civilian football grounds. Rivalries developed between barracks that took on genuine intensity. Prisoners trained seriously, developed tactics, took pride in their team's performances in ways that temporarily allowed them to forget they were imprisoned thousands of miles from home. Camps organized internal tournaments that ran for weeks or months with league formats that any civilian football administrator would recognize. Match results were recorded meticulously. League tables tracked wins, draws, losses, goals scored and conceded. Teams competed not just for pride but for trophies crafted from scrap materials by prisoner artisans with remarkable ingenuity. Welders fashioned cups from salvaged metal sheeting taken from broken equipment or donated by sympathetic guards. Carpenters carved wooden shields from lumber scraps. Artists painted emblems and team names with whatever pigments they could obtain or manufacture from natural materials. These trophies were awarded in ceremonies that took on surprising formality, with camp commandants sometimes presenting awards and making speeches acknowledging the quality of play. Winning teams displayed their trophies in barracks' common areas with pride that demonstrated how seriously prisoners took these competitions. The quality of football varied enormously depending on which prisoners happened to be in which camps. Some camps contained former professional or semi-professional players who brought genuine expertise to prison football. Camp authorities discovered they held several players who had competed at high levels before military service. Regional league players, youth national team members, even a few who had played in Germany's top divisions before conscription. These players became coaches and tacticians, organizing training sessions and teaching techniques to less skilled prisoners. Other camps contained mostly farmers and laborers with limited football experience but enormous enthusiasm. The matches between well-skilled teams could be remarkably sophisticated, with tactical formations and passing movements that demonstrated real understanding of the game. Matches between less skilled teams were enthusiastic chaos featuring more running than technique. but they served the same psychological purposes of providing community, competition, and temporary escape from captivity's monotony. Some camps took football even further, organizing matches between German prisoners and local British teams from nearby towns and villages. These matches required special permission from camp commandants and local authorities, involved security arrangements to transport prisoners to external playing fields or to bring British civilians onto campgrounds, and created situations that seemed surreal given the context of total war. The Boxing Day 1946 match at Hatfield Heath was typical of these encounters. German prisoners of war and British civilians competing in organized football, with spectators from both groups watching together, represented normalized human interaction that Nazi ideology insisted was impossible between superior Germans and inferior British degenerates. The Hatfield Heath match drew an estimated crowd of 750 to 1,000 spectators, an extraordinary attendance for a village match that reflected intense curiosity about these German prisoners who had been living and working in the local area. The crowd was segregated by order of military authorities nervous about fraternization. British villagers on one side of the pitch, German prisoners on the opposite side, with armed guards maintaining the separation. The prisoners were under strict orders that they had to behave themselves, stand at attention when not actively watching play, and were only allowed to clap politely when their team scored. No cheering, no celebrations, no emotional displays that might disturb the fragile peace. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Men who had recently been trying to kill each other were now competing in sport while armed guards ensured everyone remained civil. The German team's 11-0 victory was so comprehensive that it embarrassed the local side. But the villagers took their defeat with good humor and extended hospitality afterward that would have been unthinkable during the war itself. The last surviving Hatfield Heath player who participated in the match, Ron Pudding Jones, died years later without the club ever tracing any members of the prisoner team to invite them back for commemorations. Local historian Mark Ratcliffe noted that several of the prisoners settled in the area after being freed, integrated into the community, married local women, and lived out their lives in England rather than returning to devastated Germany. The match became part of village identity, commemorated 75 years later as the most famous match in club history despite being their heaviest defeat. Other matches between prisoners and British civilians occurred throughout 1946 and 1947 as restrictions on prisoner movement were gradually relaxed. British guards began playing competitive football matches against their prisoners in games that started as informal kickabouts and evolved into organized fixtures with genuine competitive edge. At camps like Devil's Camp in Wiltshire in October 1946, British guards and German prisoners played regular matches where tackles were hard but fair, where the ball stuck in October mud and the game continued anyway, where corporal and captured soldier competed shoulder to shoulder with no malice despite the fact that just months earlier they had been mortal enemies. By April 1947, the evolution had progressed even further. Former prisoners who had transitioned to civilian labor status under the European Volunteer Worker Scheme found themselves playing for mixed teams, half German, half British, competing in civilian leagues against pit teams and factory sides. At a coal depot in Mansfield, a team fielding former German soldiers and British coal workers competed in the Nottingham Colliery League, finishing fourth out of 12 teams that season. The league's secretary, who had been invalid out of military service after being wounded at Tobruk, told a Ministry of Labor inspector that he hadn't announced the Germans' presence, hadn't hidden it either, and that while one team from Clipstone refused to shake hands after matches, most accepted the mixed team without protest. The matches represented something profound, complete normalization where former enemies competed as equals under civilian sporting rules. Perhaps the most famous German prisoner to benefit from British camp football was Bernhard Karl Bert Trautmann, captured during fighting in France and sent to a prisoner of war camp at Ashton in Makerfield near Wigan in 1945. Trautmann excelled during football matches played in the camp, demonstrating exceptional goalkeeping ability that caught the attention of local football scouts. After his release from prisoner status, he began playing for amateur clubs in the Manchester area. Despite death threats and protests from some supporters who objected to a former German paratrooper playing for an English club, Trautmann signed for Manchester City in 1949 and became one of the greatest goalkeepers in the club's history. He played 545 matches for City, won the FA Cup in 1956 despite playing the final 75 minutes with a broken neck sustained in a collision, was named Football Writers Association Footballer of the Year in 1956, and became such an integral part of Manchester that he lived there until his death in 2013. His journey from German prisoner playing football behind barbed wire to English football legend symbolized the transformative power of sport to bridge divides that warfare had created. The psychological significance of these football matches cannot be overstated. Sport represents one of humanity's most fundamental social activities. Rule-governed competition that channels aggressive instincts into structured outlets where conflict is contained by mutual agreement to abide by rules, accept referee decisions, and shake hands after the final whistle regardless of result. By allowing and even encouraging football, British authorities sent a message more powerful than any propaganda statement. You are still human beings entitled to human activities and human dignity despite being our prisoners and despite the fact that you fought for a regime we destroyed. This recognition of shared humanity created cognitive dissonance for prisoners who had been taught that the British saw Germans as subhuman enemies to be destroyed without mercy. How could you believe your captors viewed you as inferior when they provided footballs, organized leagues, facilitated matches against British civilian teams, and sometimes joined games themselves? How could you maintain faith in Nazi racial ideology when British guards who had lost family members to German bombs still played fair, still shook hands, still acknowledged good play regardless of which side executed it? The questions had no easy answers within Nazi ideological frameworks, and that lack of answers created doubt that accumulated daily throughout months and years of captivity. Beyond football, camps developed rich cultural lives that challenged Nazi narratives about British Philistinism and cultural degeneracy. Musical instruments were allowed, and prisoners with musical training formed orchestras that became central features of camp life. These were not simple amateur ensembles but sophisticated organizations that performed classical repertoire with remarkable competence given the circumstances. Professional musicians who had served in Wehrmacht military bands before capture brought genuine expertise to camp orchestras. Some had been conservatory-trained musicians conscripted into military service. Others had been professional orchestra members or music teachers in civilian life. They found themselves in the strange position of being able to practice their art more freely in British captivity than they had in Wehrmacht service, where military duties took precedence over musical development. Camp orchestras performed classical concerts featuring the German musical canon that had been central to Nazi claims of Aryan cultural superiority. Beethoven symphonies, Mozart concertos, Bach fugues, Wagner operas arranged for available instrumentation. The irony was not subtle. German prisoners performing the greatest achievements of German culture for audiences that included British guards and civilians who appreciated musical excellence, regardless of its national origin. The performances demonstrated that German cultural achievements existed independently of Nazi ideology, that Beethoven's humanity transcended the barbarism committed in Germany's name, that music could create connections across divides that politics had rendered seemingly unbridgeable. Some camps acquired quality instruments through International Committee of the Red Cross donations specifically designated for cultural activities. Other instruments were purchased through neutral intermediaries using funds provided by German authorities before communication channels broke down entirely. Still others were donated by British churches and cultural organizations as humanitarian gestures or loaned by local music societies willing to trust German prisoners with valuable instruments. The acquisition of a good violin or a proper brass instrument became occasions for celebration within camps, expanding the orchestra's capabilities and allowing more ambitious repertoire to be attempted. Concerts became significant social events within camps, occasions when prisoners dressed in their cleanest uniforms, when barracks were straightened and made as presentable as possible, when the makeshift concert hall was decorated with whatever materials prisoners could obtain. Camp commandants sometimes attended performances alongside prisoners, sitting in chairs provided at the front of improvised concert halls, applauding with evident appreciation when movements concluded, sometimes even making brief remarks thanking the musicians for their efforts. These moments of shared appreciation for musical excellence created human connections across the divide of nationality and military status that were impossible to maintain when viewing each other solely as captor and captive. British guards stood at respectful attention during performances rather than maintaining the alert posture of security personnel watching for escape attempts. Local British civilians were sometimes invited to attend concerts, particularly in smaller camps where relationships between prisoners and local communities had developed over months of proximity. These civilian attendees sat alongside prisoners in makeshift concert halls fashioned from mess halls or recreation barracks, listened to German musicians perform German composers, and applauded performances that demonstrated artistic excellence transcended national boundaries. The sight of British civilians and German prisoners sharing appreciation for Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or Mozart's Requiem represented normalization that Nazi propaganda insisted was impossible. Degenerate British Philistines could not appreciate true German culture, yet here they sat applauding German musicians. Bands played lighter music for camp dances and social events, providing entertainment that maintained morale through accessible popular repertoire rather than challenging classical programs. German folk songs, popular melodies from before the war, even jazz and swing despite official Nazi disapproval of such degenerate music, all found their way into camp band repertoires. Dances were organized where prisoners could move to music, clap rhythms, and momentarily forget the barbed wire surrounding them. The normalization of social activities like dances demonstrated British policy that prisoners should be maintained in reasonable mental health through access to normal human activities rather than broken through deliberate psychological pressure. Theaters existed in many camps where prisoners staged their own productions drawing on Germany's rich theatrical tradition that stretched back centuries. German prisoners organized acting companies that performed everything from classical drama to light comedy, from Goethe's Faust, exploring themes of human striving and moral responsibility, to contemporary boulevard farces offering escapist entertainment. They performed Schiller's dramas about freedom and tyranny that took on additional meaning in the context of captivity. They staged Brecht's social commentaries and Hauptmann's naturalistic examinations of human nature. They even performed contemporary works and adaptations that demonstrated prisoners' engagement with ideas beyond Nazi-approved culture. The theatrical productions required remarkable ingenuity given the constraints of captivity. Prisoners built sets from scrap materials, discarded lumber salvaged from broken equipment, cardboard boxes accumulated from Red Cross parcels, whatever they could obtain through camp administration or appropriate for materials destined for disposal. They fashioned costumes from whatever fabric they could acquire, uniforms modified and dyed using improvised dyes made from natural materials, blankets cut and sewn into period dress, curtains repurposed into theatrical costumes. They improvised props with creativity born of necessity, creating entire stage productions from materials that any conventional theater company would have dismissed as worthless. The technical challenges were enormous. Lack of proper lighting equipment, limited space in barracks converted to theaters, no professional stage machinery for scene changes, no budget for materials. Yet prisoners overcame these obstacles through determination that spoke to deep human needs for artistic expression and cultural continuity. The productions were sometimes remarkably sophisticated despite the limitations, with direction, staging, and performances that demonstrated real theatrical talent among the prisoner population. Former professional actors who had performed in German theaters before military service brought expertise to camp productions. Amateur actors discovered theatrical talents they hadn't known they possessed. The performances were conducted sometimes for fellow prisoners, providing entertainment and cultural connection, and occasionally for local British audiences invited to attend, creating situations where captors and captives sat together watching German prisoners perform. One particularly well-documented example occurred at camps in Scotland, where German prisoners produced theater shows that became significant enough to be revived and celebrated decades later as historical cultural events. British guards and local civilians who attended these performances sometimes found themselves deeply moved by the quality of the productions and the humanity evident in the performances. It was one thing to guard prisoners as military duty, quite another to watch those same prisoners perform Goethe with evident passion and skill that demonstrated artistic excellence transcended national boundaries. For prisoners, the theatrical performances provided multiple layers of psychological benefit. They offered creative outlets for artistic prisoners who could write, direct, act, design sets, compose music. They provided community building as casts rehearsed together over weeks, developing bonds through shared creative work that transcended the circumstances of their captivity. They connected prisoners to cultural identity that existed independently of their status as defeated combatants. They were not just failed soldiers but Germans with cultural heritage worth preserving and celebrating. And they demonstrated agency and accomplishment in an environment where so much was controlled by others. A successful theatrical production represented achievement that prisoners could claim as their own. Libraries offered books in German that opened intellectual worlds to prisoners who had spent their adult lives under Nazi cultural censorship. Camp libraries developed extensive collections running to thousands of volumes in some facilities. The sources of these books varied. Some were donated by German communities in Britain before the war, some were purchased through neutral intermediaries, some came from International Committee of the Red Cross allocations, and some were simply seized from German vessels or aircraft and repurposed for prisoner education. The collections were remarkably comprehensive given wartime constraints. Prisoners could check out books using library cards and lending systems identical to civilian public libraries. They could read in their leisure time in designated reading rooms or in their barracks quarters. The intellectual engagement this permitted was significant beyond mere entertainment or passing time. Men who had been fed Nazi propaganda their entire adult lives suddenly had access to works of literature and philosophy that had been banned in Germany or available only in censored editions that removed passages deemed incompatible with Nazi ideology. They could read Goethe's humanistic writings emphasizing individual dignity and human brotherhood without Nazi party interpretations imposed upon them that twisted Goethe into a proto-fascist. They could study Enlightenment philosophy, Kant's emphasis on rational thought and individual moral duty, Voltaire's satire of tyranny and religious dogmatism, Rousseau's theories of social contract, that stood in direct contradiction to Nazi blood and soil mysticism and leader worship. They could encounter German-language works by Jewish authors that had been burned in the 1933 book burnings or removed from libraries and bookstores throughout the Reich, Heinrich Heine's poetry, Franz Kafka's novels exploring alienation and bureaucratic absurdity, Stefan Zweig's humanistic essays. They could read histories of Germany that presented alternative narratives to the Nazi version of German history as inevitable progression toward National Socialist triumph. They could access translations of British and American literature that presented perspectives on democracy, individual rights, and social organization fundamentally different from fascist ideology. John Stuart Mill on liberty, Thomas Paine on democracy, American constitutional theory. The camp libraries were carefully curated by British authorities with multiple objectives beyond simple humanitarian provision of reading material. First, they provided constructive activity that reduced boredom and its associated disciplinary problems. Occupied prisoners with books to read created fewer security issues than bored. Restless men with nothing to do but nurse grievances and plot resistance. Second, they demonstrated British commitment to treating prisoners as human beings capable of intellectual engagement rather than as animals to be merely penned and fed. Third, and perhaps most importantly from British strategic perspective, they subtly introduced ideas and perspectives that challenged Nazi ideology without overt propaganda that would have been rejected as enemy manipulation. A prisoner reading Thomas Mann's novels encountered humanistic German culture that existed independently of Nazism and indeed had been driven into exile by Nazi barbarism. A prisoner studying European history from non-Nazi sources encountered alternative perspectives on Germany's place in European civilization that contradicted Nazi narratives of eternal German victimization by jealous neighbors. These encounters planted seeds of doubt that might take months or years to germinate but would eventually challenge ideological certainty in ways more profound than any direct argument could achieve. You could dismiss a British propagandist as an enemy liar, but you could not so easily dismiss Goethe or Schiller or Kant. These were German voices, pillars of German culture, and they spoke of values incompatible with Nazism. Prisoners formed informal book discussion groups where they debated what they had read, engaged with ideas in ways that had been impossible under Nazi Germany's intellectual conformity. These discussions sometimes became heated as prisoners with different political views argued about interpretations and implications. Former Nazi true believers tried to defend ideology against challenges posed by what they were reading. Anti-Nazi prisoners found validation in texts that confirmed their rejection of the regime. Most prisoners fell somewhere in between, pragmatic men trying to understand what had happened to Germany and what kind of nation they would return to when captivity ended. Camp magazines were produced by prisoners themselves, often with sophisticated layouts, illustrations, and content ranging from news summaries to poetry to humor to philosophical essays. These publications required approval from camp commandants and were subject to censorship that removed content considered security risks or inflammatory, but they represented genuine prisoner voices expressing perspectives on captivity, reflecting on the war, and maintaining intellectual engagement with ideas and current events. The production process itself provided purpose beyond the final product. Editors selected content from submissions, Writers contributed articles on topics ranging from camp sports results to literary criticism. Artists created illustrations and political cartoons, and distribution networks ensured magazines reached readers throughout the camp. Reading and discussing camp magazines became social activity as prisoners debated articles, disputed perspectives, and formed opinions about matters beyond immediate camp life. The magazines documented camp culture, match reports from football leagues, reviews of theatrical performances, profiles of interesting prisoners, humor columns poking fun at camp life's absurdities. They maintained connections to intellectual life that many prisoners feared losing during years of captivity. They demonstrated that prisoners remained thinking individuals capable of producing cultural artifacts despite their circumstances. The British government published a weekly German-language newspaper specifically for prisoners called WWII Post that provided news from war fronts and world events from Allied perspectives. This publication was distributed to all camps and represented British willingness to keep prisoners informed rather than maintaining them in information vacuum. The content was obviously shaped to present Allied interpretations of events, but it was factual news rather than crude propaganda, and prisoners could compare information from multiple sources, including letters from home and camp rumor networks, to form their own judgments about accuracy. As German military fortunes declined from 1943 onward, WWII Post became an increasingly important vehicle for demonstrating to prisoners that Nazi claims of inevitable victory were false and that Germany was losing the war comprehensively. Articles documented Allied advances across Europe with maps showing the shrinking territory under German control. Reports from the Eastern Front made clear the devastating Soviet counteroffensive. Coverage of Allied bombing campaigns demonstrated the destruction being inflicted on German cities. For prisoners isolated from direct news of the war's progress, WWII Post provided reality check against Nazi propaganda that continued to claim imminent German victory even as Allied armies approached Berlin. The relationship between guards and prisoners evolved over time in ways that surprised both groups and created interpersonal dynamics more complex than simple captor-captive relationships. Initial hostility and mutual suspicion were natural and expected. British soldiers guarding men whose comrades had bombed British cities, killing thousands of British civilians, could not immediately separate individuals from national entities. German prisoners initially viewed all British soldiers through the lens of Nazi propaganda as potential torturers awaiting opportunities for brutality. But sustained proximity and daily interaction gradually created familiarity that moderated these extreme positions. Guards learned which prisoners could be trusted with certain responsibilities, supervising work details without constant oversight, mediating conflicts among prisoners to maintain camp order, administering internal camp organization like meal distribution and barack cleaning rosters. Prisoners learned which guards were fair-minded professionals who followed regulations without unnecessary harshness and which guards were prone to petty abuses of authority that, while not rising to the level of Geneva Convention violations, made life more difficult than necessary. A strange equilibrium developed over months and years of captivity, neither friendship nor pure enmity, but professional working relationships between individuals who recognized each other's humanity despite being on opposite sides of a war. Small courtesies were exchanged that would have seemed impossible during initial captivity. "Good morning, Corporal." "Morning, Klaus." "Sleep well." Such mundane interactions represented normalization of relations that Nazi propaganda had insisted was impossible. Guards shared cigarettes with prisoners during breaks, precious commodities under wartime rationing offered as gestures of common humanity. Prisoners helped guards with tasks outside formal work assignments when such help made both their lives easier, carrying heavy equipment, translating communications with non-English-speaking prisoners, providing labor for projects that benefited everyone. Conversations developed beyond minimum necessary communication. Guards asked about prisoners' families back in Germany, expressing genuine concern about the welfare of people they would never meet. Prisoners inquired about guards' civilian lives before military service, learning about farms and shops and families waiting for the war to end. These personal exchanges did not erase the fundamental power imbalance between captor and captive, but they created human connections that made it harder to maintain ideological hatred when you knew the name of your enemy's children and he knew yours. Some guards developed genuine respect for certain prisoners based on professional recognition of military competence. A British Army veteran who had fought in France might recognize in a captured Wehrmacht sergeant the same qualities of leadership and courage he valued in his own comrades. An RAF ground crew member might grudgingly admire the technical skill of a Luftwaffe mechanic who could repair aircraft engines with minimal tools and improvised parts. These recognitions of professional competence created unexpected bonds across national lines that sometimes developed into conversations touching on deeper questions. Why are we fighting? What will happen when the war ends? Do you believe what your leaders tell you? These discussions, conducted quietly during work details or evening recreation periods, represented ideological challenges more effective than formal propaganda because they came from trusted sources, fellow military professionals who had earned respect through demonstrated competence rather than enemy propagandists whose motives were suspect. The International Committee of the Red Cross played a crucial role in maintaining and documenting the treatment of prisoners that went far beyond delivering parcels, though those parcels were themselves significant. Red Cross parcels became important parts of camp life, serving as tangible symbols of the international humanitarian infrastructure that protected prisoners even during total war. These packages distributed regularly to German prisoners contained food, cigarettes, soap, and personal items that supplemented British rations and provided luxuries otherwise unavailable. Standard parcel contents included items like canned meat providing protein, condensed milk adding calories and calcium, chocolate offering quick energy and morale boost, coffee unavailable to British civilians under rationing, sugar for sweetening poor quality tea, cheese adding variety to monotonous diets, biscuits that kept well, cigarettes that served as camp currency, and soap for personal hygiene. The parcels were packed according to standardized lists by Red Cross organizations in neutral countries like Switzerland and shipped to Britain through complex logistics that continued operating even when shipping was dangerous due to submarine warfare threatening Atlantic convoys. The psychological value of Red Cross parcels exceeded their material value significant though that was. They demonstrated that someone outside the camp, an international organization operating on humanitarian principles, cared about prisoner conditions and was working actively to improve them. They proved that international law still functioned despite the war, that neutral powers were monitoring compliance with Geneva Convention standards, that prisoners had not been forgotten or abandoned by the international community to whatever fate their captors chose. Prisoners who received regular Red Cross parcels felt connected to systems larger than the bilateral conflict between Britain and Germany that had imprisoned them, and this connection provided hope that civilized standards might prevail despite the barbarism of total war. The parcels also provided practical leverage for prisoners dealing with camp administrators. A prisoner who received cigarettes he did not smoke personally could trade them to guards for small favors or services. Prisoners could use Red Cross parcel contents to supplement official rations in ways that allowed them to maintain better health and energy. The parcels represented power and agency in an environment where prisoners had little of either. The cumulative effect of these facilities and activities was profound and systematic. British camp administrators understood that occupied prisoners with structured activities caused fewer security problems and maintained better mental health than bored prisoners with nothing to do but obsess over grievances. But the psychological impact on prisoners went far beyond camp administration's intended purposes of maintaining order and security. Prisoners experienced a civilization that maintained cultural and recreational standards even during total war fought for national survival. They saw their captors invest resources, footballs, musical instruments, library books, theater materials, in prisoner welfare when those resources could have been devoted entirely to the war effort. They witnessed British soldiers and civilians who had lost loved ones to German military action yet still treated prisoners with professional courtesy and sometimes even kindness. These observations accumulated daily over months and years, creating cognitive dissonance that Nazi indoctrination could not resolve. If the British were truly the barbaric, degenerate Philistines that Nazi propaganda portrayed, why did they organize football leagues, provide musical instruments for orchestras, stock libraries with thousands of books, facilitate theatrical productions? If British civilization was collapsing under the weight of war as German radio broadcasts claimed, why was camp life so orderly, supplies so reliable, administration so professional? If the British viewed Germans as subhuman enemies to be destroyed, why were they investing effort and resources in maintaining German cultural activities and intellectual life? The answers prisoners developed to these questions varied by individual temperament and political conviction, but the questions themselves were corrosive to ideological certainty. Nazi propaganda depended on simple narratives. We are superior, they are inferior, our victory is inevitable, their civilization is decadent and doomed. Daily life in British prisoner of war camps systematically contradicted every element of these narratives. German prisoners were not superior when British civilization demonstrated greater adherence to legal norms and humane values. British society was not inferior when it maintained standards even under existential pressure. German victory was not inevitable when the productive capacity and social organization prisoners observed made clear that Germany had already lost. British civilization was not decadent when it treated defeated enemies with dignity that Nazi Germany never accorded to its prisoners. For many prisoners, especially those captured later in the war who had less ideological indoctrination and more direct experience of German military failure, British treatment became the catalyst for questioning everything they had been taught about racial hierarchies, national characters, and historical destiny. The football matches where German and British players competed as sporting equals challenged Nazi claims of unbridgeable racial differences. The orchestras performing Beethoven for appreciative British audiences challenged Nazi claims of British cultural degeneracy. The libraries stocked with banned books challenged Nazi control of information and ideas. The theaters staging productions that explored human freedom and moral responsibility challenged Nazi demands for unthinking obedience. The transformation was not universal. Some prisoners clung to Nazi ideology despite everything they witnessed, retreating into conspiracy theories and denial rather than accepting that they had been systematically lied to. But for many prisoners, the accumulated evidence became impossible to ignore. They had expected torture and found football. They had expected starvation and found adequate food supplemented by Red Cross parcels. They had expected brutal guards and found professional soldiers doing their duty according to established rules. They had expected cultural wasteland and found orchestras, theaters, libraries. The contrast between expectation and reality was too profound, too consistent, too sustained to dismiss as elaborate deception. As prisoners eventually returned to Germany in the years after 1945, they carried these experiences with them. Some became influential figures in West German Reconstruction, bringing lessons about democracy, rule of law, and possibility of peaceful coexistence between former enemies. Others simply lived private lives shaped by recognition that the ideology they had fought for was built on lies exposed by direct experience of British treatment. The football matches, orchestra concerts, theatrical performances, and library discussions became memories that challenged simple narratives about the war and Germany's role in it. And those memories, multiplied across 400,000 individual experiences, contributed to West Germany's eventual rejection of militarism and embrace of democratic values in ways more profound than any occupation policy could achieve. The British had discovered, perhaps more by accident than design initially, that treating your enemies with humanity when you have every reason for vengeance proves the superiority of your values more effectively than any propaganda campaign. The football matches and orchestras were not merely humanitarian gestures but demonstrations of civilizational confidence. We can afford to treat you well because our civilization's strength does not depend on brutality. For German prisoners expecting torture, this demonstration was more devastating to Nazi ideology than interrogation or propaganda could ever achieve.